Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here on the opening day of From Classroom to Boardroom, a virtual event series that'll address issues of race and equity in the workplace in Charlottesville, Virginia, and across the country. Thank you to the United Way of Greater Charlottesville, the University of Virginia, and the Virginia Tourism Corporation for their support in bringing this program to life, as well as countless other partners and collaborators in our community and beyond. If you missed the keynote this morning with Simone Sanders and Ben Allen, we encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. Where all of these incredible conversations will live on. So with that, panels here, you're attending the Transformative Value of Diversity and Inclusion, and I'm going to send it over to Mary Coleman to get us started.
All right, Ben, thank you. And thanks to Tom for hosting this incredible panel of dynamic professionals in front of me. I'm so honored to lead this conversation that we're going to have with Kaya Jones, who's program director at Ron Brown Scholars Program, Ebony Hilton, who is an anesthesiologist at the University of Virginia, and my friend and longtime college comrade, Gabe Montgomery, who's founding member of Montgomery Compliance Law out of Richmond. And I want this to be a conversation, and I want us to think about diversity and inclusion across two domains. One, the employee side, right? We want employees who are listening in today, especially people of color, to understand your value, what you're bringing to the table, to develop your confidence as a professional and not allow the noise of the diversity and inclusion conversation interfere with your intrinsic value as a human being and as a professional. You bring great skills and talents to the table, and this group of ladies will affirm that and also, provide some practical tips in advancing your career. And then the second domain is for the employers who are listening and sort of cutting through the political correctness that you may feel surrounds the diversity and inclusion conversation, and the box that you've sort of conditioned yourself to think about checking around diversity and inclusion, and think instead about how diversity can bring value to your organization. It'll impact your bottom line financially. It's going to bring dynamic talent to your organization. It's going to impact the community where you live. And it's more than just a compliance issue, as our friend Gay will articulate. So those are the two domains. We welcome your questions. I think we didn't ask about that, but if you've got questions, maybe you can throw them in a chat box. So what I want to do is start by pulling from the description that this panel was built on with a set of questions. And the first statement in the panel description was, the range of human potential is vast, and a flexible understanding of employee value can maximize your potential as an organization. So this is for our employers out there. And I'm going to direct this question to Gay. You have spent almost 20 years in the corporate space and have both led teams and seen leaders, good, bad, and ugly. The concept of diversity in the workplace has evolved over the span of your career, yet many employers default to viewing it as an issue of compliance, that box to check. Tell us how diversity gives employers a competitive advantage.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me to participate and share this virtual stage with such fabulous women. One of my favorite authors is Thomas Friedman. He is famous for a book called The World is Flat, and thank you for being late. The World is Flat was probably the first time I started thinking about my children, who were then very young, that their competitive set was broader than the school that they were attending at the time. Well, Thomas Friedman was interviewing Astro Teller, who was then CEO of Google X's research lab, and they drew this cool chart that everybody uses all the time to explain that the pace of change is outpacing humans' ability to keep up, to adapt. And in my own area, I see this because Thomson Reuters would issue these assessments saying every 7 minutes, a new regulatory alert would be passed. So that's just in my little tiny space. Long short, it's impossible for any one individual, or frankly, any small group of homogenous individuals to keep up with that kind of change. And this applies to almost any area. It's just impossible for any one homogenous group to have the answers to the questions that the world needs now. So sometime in the last decade, asking the right questions, not having the right answers, but asking the right questions became the coin of the realm and a crucial factor in human and organizational outcome. And here's the rub. Different people ask different questions. But for those people to ask those questions, they need to be both included in the conversations, like where they are taking place. And then their voices need to be actively facilitated. And so much is made, Mary, of the division in our society today. Well, a lot of that is because people are just asking different questions. So for all the evil that is brought about by virtue of this division, the upside is for employers that tap into the fact that so many people just think differently, are asking different questions, the closer they are to being able to develop more sustainable solutions. And DEI is messy. A compliance approach is simply not going to get you the bang for your buck. And I have to tell you, it's a big investment. And so if a compliance approach to D&I ever did work, it ceased working about a decade ago.
That's a good revelation. So what you're saying is, if we're talking about a Venn diagram where we're bringing people together to the conversation in the workplace, right? And you've got different people, that sweet spot in the middle where they all come together is where the dynamism is, where the new ideas are, right? Where you're going to generate more revenue, right? And where you're going to discover new inventions is where people come together and collectively collaborate around their different ideas.
You have on this panel women, and at least some of us have children. You see this in your own families, just how different. I only have two, and they are as different as night and day. And I have to tell you, if I want to have a certain type of conversation, I have it with my son. If I want to have a different conversation, I want to have it with my daughter. Her insights are just different. This plays out both within and among companies, because that's another thing. The more diverse your employee base, the more diverse their connections and influences. And so you have all of those influences sort of flowing into your company that frankly just don't exist if your employee base consists of the same people who go to the same clubs and have the same influences. And I have to tell you all this stuff, you don't have to believe me. I'm not an expert in this. I do read, and a wonderful book came out earlier this year called Social Chemistry, which just talks about how you optimize those influences for your good.
That's great. Kaya or Ebony, from your experience, have you seen this dynamic play out where you've got collaborative approach and value added by a diverse set of colleagues?
I've certainly seen that play out. First, I'd like to thank Tom for inviting us and convening us for this important conversation. And thank you, Mary, for serving as a host. But I totally agree with Gay's point. And you find it in the old adage that if you have two people who agree all of the time, one of them is unnecessary. In this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we often overlook the value of thought diversity. And that's the idea of mining talent to show them that you value their different perspectives and the life experiences that they bring to the job, but also that you'll take the time to recognize those different experiences and see how you can leverage them to advance your shared work and your shared values. And so I certainly agree.
That's great. How about
and
you,
I would
Ebony?
echo on that too. I think one thing that employers miss is that if you don't have that diversity of persons, and not only just in terms of race and religion and gender, the big things, buckets we always think about, but literally life lived experiences. What we know is that if your clientele is the nation, if your community is your population base, then persons from that community when they're looking at your systems of operation, they already know where the problems exist because they've had to navigate that system, right? As being your customers, they had to navigate how to overcome those hurdles of having access to your product. And so if you hire someone, they may not have these degrees on their wall that says I'm an expert in this area, but their lived life experience will allow you to avoid major inefficiencies in your company system, allow you to avoid costly errors that they can tell you from day one that won't work because it won't reach us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not to think of people as a monolith. All Black people are not the same. All white people are not the same. All males are not the same. You need to have a collective deep search to say, where are we missing that characteristic, that quality trait? And that's where you can really push your company and your mission to the next level to be truly inclusive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's speak to that in terms of age. Simone said something earlier about intergenerational wisdom and sharing across the generations, and the need for both younger and older employees to be at this table of ideas. Let's weigh in on that.
Is that me?
Anyone?
Okay. I don't want to hawk, so if someone else wants to jump in. No, I mean, because again, diversity of ideas. So Kaya, I don't know if you wanted to.
Sure, I'd like to hop in there. We definitely see age come into play as we work and form partnerships with community organizations, corporations, and colleges and universities to connect our student base to opportunities. What we're finding is that a lot of colleges and universities, corporate employers, they often recruit from traditional sources. And so that means that they're missing out on huge pools of talent that may not be accessible through those traditional sources. I work in the higher education and college access space. And so I'm thinking particularly about how, certain colleges and universities will only recruit certain students who come from a specific school, perhaps a specific private school, or students with a specific experience. And the problem is that they're missing out on incredibly dynamic students who could greatly benefit from that opportunity because they're not going to and taking the time and investing the dollars in diversifying their recruitment sources. And so you really have to have younger people at the table to tell you where they congregate, where they digest information and consume information, and what are the qualities of the groups that they are more likely to join and engage. And if you don't have that conversation, you're going to see negative outcomes as you build your applicant pools, as you try to with your inner office relations and in your project outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Great answer.
Mary, by the same token, thinking that all you need are millennials is another mistake. I mean, there are some mistakes that companies have made. In fact, I was speaking with a client, and they had gone through this huge issue a decade earlier, and they then went through the same issue because nobody remembered. You know what I mean? There was nobody on the ground who remembered how awful that was.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's at the same time as you want the most current thinking, and particularly, and all of this, of course, depends on who your market is. But I actually don't have much patience for a single generation, single color, single ethnicity, anything in my life, unless it just happened to be sitting around my kitchen or something, because I want those influences.
Mm-hmm.
I want to check my own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what employers should want. Things are changing. And so what you thought last week, what you thought, and certainly what you thought 5-10 years ago, it's just not applicable anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things we have to consider, though, when we're talking about age, is the fact that there is ageism in ways, in that people say you need to have experience, but what experience can a millennial have that can match the 30 years of experience that someone of another generation can say, again, that I can present this letter of certificate to say I've done this. And so when we're looking at companies and looking at leadership, I can speak for the hospital system itself, our leadership, very much does not have a millennial touch to it. These systems that are in place, and we see this even in looking at real life situations of vaccine rollout, right? What does it mean when you neglect to think about all categories of life that people go through? When we're looking at even leadership, we also see where women are largely left out because, as you know, Ms. Gay said, that they have families, they have children, and how am I supposed to balance these two things? And when we're looking at promotion of persons and how we are checking boxes to say this person qualifies for that next step, companies are literally cutting themselves at their Achilles heel because they aren't taking into consideration that if I miss that voice at the table, yes, she's a mother of 3 kids and she's trying to balance all of that, and no, she hasn't done this, and this, but because of the experience that she has in navigating and balancing those things and still keeping her head on straight, she is a great asset to teach us how to balance this budget, how to to really engage the youth, because she's actively trying to raise teenagers. That's the experience, again, that I feel like companies are at a miss in this day and time, that we really have to start discussing what does diversity look like in action and not just in theory.
Well, that's a beautiful comment. It certainly affirms all the women and men who are at home raising their children and investing in their family at this stage of their lives, and sort of feeling like career-wise they're somehow wasting away. And that's not the case, right? And as long as we have more employers who understand the value of that juggle, right? And the talent and the skill and the grit that it takes to get that dinner on the table and everybody clothed and fed, like that's a big deal, certainly for me as a mom of 7 children who spent 22 years at home. So thank you. All the moms out there are clapping for that. But it's a good way.
You deserve a whole holiday, 7 kids.
Mary, I don't think we should, and Ebony, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that hiring broadly is harder. It's just harder. It's harder in the search. It's harder in the execution. My first job after leaving my law firm, I used to joke with my boss. He had me, a mom of 2, and like a 40-year-old Jewish woman who didn't have any kids. Okay. So I was like, boy, you really hit it about right. Because he wanted somebody there all the time. And between the two of us, we could figure that out. When I started my own company, I made a conscious decision that the reason I was going to do this was to demonstrate that women with kids and to support the development of women with young children. So I have a single mom of a 3-year-old. Do I wish she could work 60 hours a week? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. No doubt about it. Do I love it that I only have her for 3 days a week? And I would prefer to have her for 5. But it was a decision.
Uh-oh.
We
lost her there for a minute.
Right.
All right.
I was going to say it's the same for our, I have a medical consulting firm, and it was the same thing. My 2 partners, they have kids. And because of that, we lean though on each other's strengths and don't think of that as being a weakness. And again, I could say it's hard for companies to go out and search for that diversity of pool, but honestly, it's not if that is your actual mission. How wide are you casting your net? Because there are plenty of as of April 2020, less than 50% of all Black adults actually had a job. We're out here ready and willing. Are you actually looking for us? And again, that's one of those things where companies oftentimes say, we want to have a diversity initiative, and we want to hold this banner and say we are inclusive. But I have a very hard time of saying, yes, you do, because no, you don't. We know women lost our jobs at higher rates in 2020. We know, and that's regardless of race, but we know that Black women and brown women in particular definitely lost our jobs at higher rates. We know that across the board as a community, racial minority groups, we are oftentimes the first ones fired and the last ones hired. If you wanted to find us, you would. And again, I will push any company to say that if you do not have the presence of those marginalized communities on your board, not only as employees, but on your board helping to make decisions, then your company is not as great as it potentially could be.
That's a
Actually
good
had
word.
something I'd like to add here as someone who does a lot of work with programs that are looking to accept more diverse students and universities who are looking to recruit more diverse applicants. I completely agree with Ebony that what we're finding is that students are hungry for opportunity. They are savvy, they are connected, they are following companies and individuals on social media and on LinkedIn and on other platforms. The problem we find is that oftentimes traditional recruitment sources are the barriers. Colleges and universities are not building partnerships with community-based organizations to diversify their recruitment pipelines. Also, what we find is really rigid, inflexible, one-dimensional definitions of what the best or ideal candidate is. A prime example is a major science foundation wanted to diversify the number of underrepresented minorities who participated in the science competition. They found that there was a training issue. Underserved students attend high schools that are underserved, and so they don't have science programs to give them the lab and research hands that they need to be competitive in the science competition. So they partnered with our organization to develop a pipeline to get students trained so that they can be more competitive. Despite all of this goodwill and all of this commitment to diversity, I found that I had to spend hours of my time trying to convince the selection committee of the science program that a student who earned a B in geometry in the 10th grade was actually a potentially really strong candidate, and that the science program needed to change its definition of what it considered to be a good student. I literally spent hours trying to find alternative metrics of success for each student, and it ended up being really an instructive tale for me, because we were ultimately able to get the one student who earned a B in geometry in 10th grade, who was almost excluded, admitted to the program. That student label went on to participate in this really rigorous program, did a great job, performed well, ended up applying to our scholarship, which is one of the most selective scholarships in the country for African-American students. We only choose, at that time, 20 scholars from an applicant pool of 5,000. So that student was named a scholar, went on to be accepted to a highly selective institution, is now currently a college junior, and is performing well in a STEM field and in a campus leader. So we find that these arbitrary metrics for what defines success and what defines the ideal candidate is often the barrier. You have to take the time, dedicate the staff, set aside the budget items to make sure that you are mining your talent pool for alternative metrics of success. So yes, the people are out there. Are companies and employees and the opportunity holders willing to do the work?
Sure. That's a great anecdote. And it's a great segue, because we have to step back, right? Especially those who are, seeking to advance their career, young people and older people, right? And we have to know our value and know our worth. And so Ebony, who was born in Little Africa, South Carolina, like who knew there was such a place? What? I gotta go Google that.
I mean, it's one of those things. It was founded immediately after the Civil War. And it was founded by a freed slave and a Cherokee Indian. And the reason why I love where I'm from is because they were literally so bold and committed to who they were, that they planted seed in the Deep South and said, we will call this Little Africa. So everyone, even the ones that tried to oppress us, if you walk into our land, you know exactly who you're going to deal with. So that's who I am.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, you were a trailblazer as the first African-American female anesthesiologist to be hired at Medical University of South Carolina in its nearly 200-year history. So kudos to you. You're a trailblazer. So what advice would you give to other professionals of color about knowing their worth and developing confidence in the workplace?
Right. Know that you didn't get there alone. I mean, honestly, when I talk about my lineage, I do talk about everyone that helped pave the way, including the women who came before me that should have had that position. So I don't take that as a trophy to say, oh, I was the first. I shouldn't have been the first, not in 2013. But at the same time, what I say then is, if I'm going to be the first, though, I refuse to be the last. And use that as a platform to say, you didn't give me something, I earned this. I earned this position through my hard work. And so I will be unapologetic and calling out the very obstacles that kept people before me from being able to be in this seat. And so if it's talking about systemic racism in society, if it's talking about the determinants, the social determinants of health and how systemic racism plays into our community structure, if it talks about going to the leadership of our hospital and say, why am I at the University of Virginia, the first Black female critical care anesthesiologist? Why am I the only Black that is currently being hired in this institution with this name associated with it? What are you doing? Because we know, again, outcomes are better. And when we're talking about in medicine, we're talking about literally life and death is better if we have representation across the board of all racial groups, gender, religion, language of primary, native tongue. So it's not something to be, just be unapologetically you. You're talented. The very fact that you've been on this hamster wheel of being a minority in a majority country, and things that should have killed you didn't, things that should have stopped you from being able to make progress didn't, tells you that you are not only capable, but you're the strongest candidate that's out there if you believed it to be true and walk by faith on that. So
that's beautiful. And any of you other ladies want to chime in on how what is it that's working inside your soul and in your mind to enable you to walk confidently into any space and know your worth?
I could start and just say that it's really the value of close personal relationships and community. What's helped me is being connected with another community of people who are also striving and who share a similar struggle. And so being able to have, the Ron Brown Scholar Program, which is my employer, have their support, having the support of other college access practitioners, and working with students who are working to show up. Students are facing immense hurdles, not just those that are posed by the pandemic and school closures, but these longstanding persistent hurdles that separated them from opportunities that could advance their career and advance their competencies in certain areas. And so working with them to see how they are stepping out and putting themselves outside of their comfort zones, and how they're trying to groom themselves and get the experience, teach themselves through YouTube, those competencies that they can't get at high school, or that may not be available at home. Watching their example is really what motivates me, and working closely with students who are also striving really gives me motivation to continue in doing this really difficult work.
That's beautiful. So you're saying, we need each other.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gay, how about you? What kind of self-talk do you do?
I'd like to echo what Kia and Ebony have said. I do a lot of self-talk, and it starts with, just because something is happening to me, it doesn't mean it has anything to do with me, okay? And to distance, because if you internalize every sort of negative experience, it's just too heavy a weight to carry, and you don't then have the mental capacity to be doing the things that you can do, that you control, to make a difference. So the questions I ask myself, in fact, for 20 years in my job, I ask myself at the end of every year, is my personal capital higher now than it was when I started the year? And that means, am I smarter? Do I know more about more things? How am I working against my financial goals? How am I working against my non-financial goals? So first of all, it means you need to have some. So, because otherwise, you're just sort of on this wheel, and you're not heading anywhere. I also really believe, to me, there is no excuse for today, in the time of the internet, the fact that you can learn pretty much anything, and oftentimes for free. There's no time, no excuse to be stagnant. Even if the hours are short, you can listen to things while you're doing the dishes. My favorite thing is I listen to Audible books while I'm on the rower. And there's no excuse for not learning and keeping an eye on your own your own, I call it your personal capital. What do you have to bring to the table? And how can you demonstrate that? I bemoan the fact that the requirements are higher. And from the employer side, they're just trying to mitigate risk. And while we need to change that, they shouldn't see employees of color as presenting higher risk, but they do. Many of them do. And so until that is fully addressed, how can you then work the other side of it?
Right.
To say,
Right.
look, if you are concerned about whether I am going to be successful, here is a record of me showing you that I have been successful, that I don't wait for people to give me opportunities. I go find them and pursue them.
That's beautiful. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's the racism though that Black people face, right? That we have to constantly prove in ways that are deemed standard merit for other persons, right? And that's what leads to burnout, especially in medicine. I can speak to that. Burnout of minority physicians for a stereotype threat and the pressures that, you know, you hear people say, oh, you were hired because you're Black, instead of being hired literally on merit. I'm sure all of us probably had multiple degrees just going into to get a job. People made fun of me because I got 3 degrees in undergrad, because I wanted to present myself when I went to med school for my interviews to say, hey, look at all my degrees. I promise I can do this, even though I come from a single parent home and this is my background. Like, let me show you. And that type of stress on a person, you know, how do we change the culture of that instead of saying that's going to be our norm? That we say, no, companies, you can't look at a Black person and automatically assume that it is a risk. How do we change that? Break that?
I agree with you, Ebony. We do need to change that. The likelihood of that changing tomorrow, though, is very low. And so I just think it's both sides. One of the great experiments currently being conducted is the decision by many, many colleges around the country to drop standardized tests. Now, it's going to be a few years before we see the data come out of that. But this concept, they've figured out how to, without the assistance of these tests, which some groups traditionally have not performed as well on, to choose excellence. And it's those kinds of things, Ebony, that I think are going to move this forward. Where a different set of indicia, frankly, that were designed in a much more plural society, that hopefully it will move the goalposts a little bit.
I'd like to chime in here just specifically since we're speaking about the, college and career space, especially with more colleges going test optional. Yes, for some colleges that already had the infrastructure to do the DEI work, who already had a diverse admission staff, who already had programs tailored to address the needs of underserved and minority students, they're finding that it's not affecting their candidate pools. But we're finding that standardized exams still pose a significant barrier for underserved and minority students, just because threshold standardized exam scores are still used to dictate which students are allowed to take dual enrollment courses. Well, we know dual enrollment courses are an opportunity for just high school students to take colleges and community classes in community college and in college to show their college competitiveness. Well, if they can't score over a certain threshold, they miss out on this opportunity that could make them, more functional in their careers. And we also see that these standardized exams are still used as thresholds within scholarship organizations. And again, they're losing talent by not using alternative metrics of success. And so we again find ourselves in a position where in some areas there are pockets of progress, where for some people who are not in opportunity deserts, who have access to information, who have social capital to know about opportunities, they are flourishing. But there's a huge and significant portion of our students who are still being left behind because of the barriers posed by standardized exams, and because colleges and universities and scholarship providers are unwilling or unable to change their outreach to minority students. And so we're still seeing this mixed landscape that we have to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and those are all really, really key points. And I think it's important to circle back to our the ways we internalize these realities to our peril, right? And so there's that balance, right? We need to address the system, and those of us who are in places of power can speak truth to power and address those systems, while also our coach in the room sort of encouraging us to continue to do that self-care, right? You know, looking at your positive qualities and doing that positive self-talk and saying, I have so much to offer and I won't let a system keep me down, right? So it's just that balance that I hope that we can get out there and convey. We have two questions
Mary,
in the
can I
chat.
chime
I'm
in?
sorry.
One more.
Sure, yep.
Another thing that, and I'm speaking for my generation of African Americans and something I have seen replicated over the generations. We have to think broader about what success is. You know, when I was coming up, a corporate job, okay? If you could get a corporate job, you needed to take a corporate job, okay? Because we couldn't get them previously. And then, of course, they provided a level of financial security that was like, why in the world would you turn that down? And I have encouraged my kids to just think broader, that we have to, and it's not that I'm saying those jobs are so hard you should stop trying to get them. It is just one slice of the economy.
Yeah.
And yeah, nobody's offering pensions these days. You know, everybody's doing the 401k route. So think broader. And then as a people, our assessment of who has made it. You know what I mean? What it means to make it.
Yep.
Look, I'm a lawyer. I did all the can you make it kind of things. You know, I went to an Ivy League school. I got a corporate job. I went to law school. So I have all of those badges. And frankly, we haven't talked about this, just the investment that Black parents make in helping their children escape some of that. I literally, I don't know what I'd be doing. I would be sunning myself on a beach, okay? And like, I'm not talking about Virginia Beach, even though Virginia Beach is nice, but I'd be sunning myself on a really, really cool beach. But for all the money I spent trying to enable my children to opt out of much of the discrimination I knew they would face. And you just shouldn't have to do that. But part of it is interrogating my own mind. Why did I think that the destinations that their paths could lead them were so critical to their making it? So much of this, as the world changes, there are all kinds of ways to make money. There are all kinds of ways to realize who you are. So I just think that's something that as a group, we need to interrogate.
I know for me, my parents, they didn't graduate from high school. And so the learning process of all this and pushing us in education was literally for survival. And again, that's where it comes down to people have different live life experiences and what does that mean? But it was how do I get you out of this heaviness? And although they didn't graduate from high school, the smartest people. And again, that's why I say these degrees mean nothing, because my mama can read me for a book. Because of the fact she raised 3 kids and she had to navigate a system without any instruction on how to do it successfully and to raise children to take tests that she hadn't even taken herself. She hadn't taken the SAT. What do you mean you have to do that? And so a lot of it was about trial and error, but I think, again, collectively, when we're thinking about going from classroom to boardroom, is remembering that a lot of stuff is not learned in the classroom. And how do you equate that to merit? How do you equate that to degrees from Ivy League schools, or to be able to say, oh, I went to a med school or this school? And how do you equate that when there is, especially in leadership, you rarely find those types of persons. And so I would say they have a PhD in life that you can't learn in a classroom. You can't buy it. It literally is just you either have it or you haven't. Yeah, so.
Yes, that's beautiful. Well, we have a couple of questions in the chat box I'd like to address if y'all are okay with that. One questioner is asking, how can philanthropy support some of the things that we've talked about? How can it put the local jobs transmission in gear? Any thoughts on how philanthropists can help in the diversity and inclusion space?
I will start. I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because I am revising my will. And, and there's this question, what happens to all your money if nobody's around to take it? And frankly, I zeroed in on organizations that take middle school African-American children from the opportunity deserts. So many organizations are focused on the big cities where there are so many opportunities. I was like, who's sort of looking in the highways and the byways, looking to just get children in middle school? And so I think that is a huge, huge, huge place for philanthropy. Opportunity deserts, getting kids to where their choices are simply broader. Their choices are broader.
It's all about exposing kids to stuff, they can't aspire to what they don't see.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we're going to all say kids probably, because I agree, but I say even younger. So when I was my family weren't college educated. Second grade, I scored on some standardized test that put me into a different group of persons. So they literally I would go to one school. They would bus me after I'd taken my social studies class or whatever. They would bus me to another school completely across town to take my STEM courses. This is second grade. From second to seventh grade, I did this every day. After we had my math, science, and English, I would actually come back to my original school to complete recess art and the liberal arts version of elementary school. That was my life. And I promise that's what changed the trajectory for me. Unfortunately, the kids in my school, my primary school, were just as smart. I used to literally teach them on the playground algebra because we were learning that in the second and third grade. And I found it so interesting, and they could do it. They just weren't given the opportunity. And if we're building prison cells based on third grade reading scores, then we need to start in kindergarten then to prevent that from happening in the third grade. And if you're thinking about philanthropy, really, truly investing in looking at all the reasons why those schools are under-resourced, helping those teachers that are doing the absolute best they can do with 40 kids in one classroom, supporting them in their energy, in their mood, and also addressing, I think one diagnosis that's really missed in these kids is PTSD. What type of trauma are they seeing as children? When we're saying they're not paying attention in class and they're going to sleep in class and they're acting out in class, has that kid eaten?
Right.
Feed them. Have they witnessed something, unfortunately, like we see with George Floyd and these little kids that are testifying today? She was a third grader testifying today. Have they witnessed something tragic and get them mental health therapists that are going to their classrooms and saying, let me speak to you? It can be in any variety any variety that you can think of. Help their parents to afford their electric bill so that the parents don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs and can actually help them learn how to read at night. That's that. Beautiful. Yeah. So
actually approach this question, or my response to this question, a little differently, just because our organization partners with so many corporations and universities and community partners. And the first thought that it elicited to me is that, when you do work where you support students, philanthropists will often come to you because they are looking for a partner and helping them to do their DEI work. But oftentimes they want to shift a lot of that burden to you. When you are busy trying to support students and trying to connect students to opportunity, it seems somehow it becomes implied that it's now your responsibility to train their staff on how to build an inclusive program and on how to make sure that all of their applicant pool is diverse and has a range of experiences, which is really unfair. much of this work has to be done in-house. And so what I've learned in talking with my own mentor, who's a philanthropist, and with forging these partnerships with other organizations, is that as community-based organizations, we get to be choosy. We get to decide whether we want to partner with someone who shares our radical vision of what philanthropy should look like. And so that means that we get to choose whether we partner with an entity or an organization that is really looking to work with individuals, working with students on an individual level to identify those individual barriers. Every organization wants to work with the students who have the perfect SAT scores and the perfect GPAs, and who have, who would make a nice brown face to put on a brochure. But is that organization, is that philanthropist willing to put their dollars where the really difficult work is? Are they willing to fund programs to help students to finance summer programs that are usually super expensive for students in the college to career pipeline? Are they willing to fund mental health initiatives? Because you have a certain community of student strivers who are super capable, but because they have underlying issues with PTSD and trauma, they have also a lot of unmet mental health needs. And the problem is that it doesn't create a flashy or sexy metric to say, I helped this student who was self-isolating, who's now more engaged and who's now applying to more opportunities. They want to see, oh, you helped 1,000 brown faces. Well, sometimes the metrics don't measure that way. And sometimes success shouldn't be measured that way. So I would encourage people who do DEI work to be really choosy in who they decide to partner with, who they decide to select as a philanthropist, and the sources for their money, because it greatly affects their work, and it affects your outcomes, and it affects your beneficiaries.
Yeah,
So.
And what you're talking about is being real, right? About some of the challenges that we face in this space, right? And as you said, everybody wants the child who's, ready for Princeton, right? And we work with a lot of children that aren't, but who have that potential that we're trying to untap. And the other question that was in the box was related to how can K through 12 public schools help children in this space? And I think from my lens of where I work, philanthropists who work with neighborhood-based organizations or community organizations that also partner with the schools, which are often under-resourced, like that marriage can be super beneficial, because I believe in public schools, and that's where a lot of the work and the money is needed. So that can be a really great partnership too. All right, we're gonna wrap up, and I'm gonna ask you each to answer this question. What would you tell your younger self? What would you tell your younger self as you think about diversity, as you think about the ways race plays into your identity, and the ways you feel like it may inhibit, not race, but racism could inhibit your trajectory? What would you tell your younger self? Because that advice would be really a gift to our listeners.
I can start. As someone who was a first generation college student from a background of deep poverty, who was just really fortunate to be selected for this scholarship that was really life-changing. I work with a lot of students who are just in that space where they're striving. They're in middle school, they're trying to make it to college, and they're trying to build careers. And the thing that I would tell my younger self is to diversify my toolkit. You know about your limitations. Okay, I don't have anyone, I may not have lunch money today, or I may not have a way to get to my after school activity, or I may not have the money to participate in a particular program. If you find ways to speak to others about your needs and what you want to explore, and put yourself in experiences where you are outside of your comfort zone, where you are engaging people who are not like you, you learn that you have all of these tools at your disposal that can tackle some of these issues. And one of the things that I learned, after graduate school and through my studies in poverty law is that, the legal process is but one tool. Some of the things that I learned through my work in political organizing is that protesting and raising awareness is but one tool. And so if you haven't had a diversity of experiences to understand which tools are at your disposal and when you can use hard and soft influences, you'll miss opportunities. So put yourself out there. That's what I tell myself.
All right, Kaya, thank you. Ebony?
Yeah, I think I would say that everything is necessary. Every bus ride back and forth as a second grader was necessary, because every experience allowed me to be, I feel like, a better physician now, because I can empathize with the most vulnerable persons in a way that if I hadn't had that upbringing and saw the things that I saw, that I wouldn't understand when people say, oh, they're non-compliant, right? That it's not intentional that they're non-compliant. It may just not have another option and to be that. And then to also to know that literally you are enough. I think oftentimes we do have this weight on us of, do I measure up? But in growing up, I've realized that, Black people in particular, if it weren't for us, we wouldn't have the definition of citizenship in the Constitution. If it wasn't for Black people, we wouldn't have the literally voting rights and what constitutes as who can vote, because that was Black people saying, give me my freedom to vote. If it weren't for Black people, we wouldn't have, standardization and definition of what public education should look like. That's Brown versus Board of Education. If it weren't for Black people, we wouldn't even have the legal definition of what is medical consent, right? Because that was us pushing to say, treat me and look at me as human. And I come from all of that. My people lived through all of that. And therefore, if they pass their DNA on to me, then I lived through it too. And so there's nothing that you can accomplish. So everything that you look at as an obstacle now, you will truly say, this is my notebook of life, and how I'm going to use that to shape future generations, and just trust that voice.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Gay.
So, as one of the oldest on this panel, so I integrated the Catholic school system in my community. And look, I was smart. I learned to read early, and I got into, I think, a trap of thinking that my value inhered in accomplishment. And I think for many people of color and different ethnicities who enter majority environments, it puts us at a disadvantage if we have devoted our entire energies to doing what I believed I had to do. I had to be the smartest. I had to produce the most. But there are other skills. The ability to, they're broadly under the category of emotional intelligence skills, developing mental complexity. I would tell myself, you are more than your accomplishments. You need to develop as a whole person and not buy into the fact that your value is reflected only in that you can put on a resume.
That's rich. All right. Well, thank you, ladies. This is a great conversation. I hope we can do it in person sometime over a glass of wine. And anybody wants to join us, we need to start a crew. This is really amazing. We feed off each other. But I believe this is going to be recorded. Ben Wilkes, you can turn it back over to you. Thanks so much for having us.
Well, no, thank you. And I hope that invitation to wine and future conversation extends this way as well.
No, dude.
Thank you all so much, and thanks everybody for being here. We've got a couple of weeks of sessions, and we encourage you showing up and showing out for all of them. And this was really wonderful. Thank you, each of you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.